Gu Ming stared at the camera in his hands as if it had personally betrayed him. It wasn't that the camera was broken or malfunctioning, no, that would have been easier to deal with. It was just that everything he had hoped for, dreamed of, had not materialized in the way he imagined. All his years of studying light, angles, shadows, and framing, hours spent with his head buried in textbooks and his fingers smudged with the sharp odor of photographic chemicals, had led him to this point. An anonymous freelance photographer. An artist, but only in the sense that no one seemed to appreciate his art. He could practically hear his mother's voice echoing in his head, "Gu Ming, you have to stop calling yourself an artist if you can't pay the rent. Maybe it's time you tried something stable." Sure, stability. That sounded great. Except it was hard to find stability in a world that barely remembered his name, let alone the intricate dance of light and shadows that he worshipped. Gu Ming's photos, when he showed them, were always described as interesting or unique, but never beautiful or revolutionary. The kind of words that would make a photographer a household name. He was in his late 20s, still stuck in a dingy apartment, crammed between towering buildings in a part of the city where light never seemed to settle. No matter how much he tweaked his settings or adjusted the aperture, there was always a sense that the city was trying to escape the frame, that it was somehow slipping out of focus and into a haze of incompleteness. His life, too, seemed just as unfocused. He wasn't even sure anymore whether he was truly in control of his craft, or if it was his craft controlling him. Just a little bit more, Gu Ming muttered to himself, adjusting the camera's lens as he peered through the viewfinder. This time, he was trying to capture the reflection of the sky on a puddle, a technique he'd seen once in a photography magazine. But even here, with his focus so sharp, he couldn't see what he wanted. All he could see was a reflection of his own frustration staring back at him. After a long, tired sigh, he lowered the camera and rubbed his temples. "Maybe this is all I'm ever going to be," he whispered. "The guy who can make a light bulb look dramatic." The invitation came at the most unexpected of times. It was late evening when the phone buzzed on his desk. Gu Ming, still working through some half-baked project, glanced at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize. Hello? He almost didn't want to pick up. It was probably some company wanting to sell him something he didn't need. "Hello, Mr. Gu Ming," a voice said from the other end. It was clear, crisp, authoritative. "I'm Dr. Wang. I'm a professor at the Institute for Experimental Photography. We're conducting a new study on the interaction between light and the human eye, and we've heard of your unique approach to photography. We would like you to be a part of our research. It could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Gu Ming raised an eyebrow. "Experimental photography? I don't even know if my style is really, well, experimental." The voice on the other end chuckled. "That's exactly why we want you. You don't fit the typical mold. And that's precisely the point. We think you'll bring something new to the table." He was skeptical, of course. It was probably some gimmick. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe this was his chance. The chance to get out of the rut. To finally do something that mattered. The Institute for Experimental Photography was housed in a sleek, modern building just on the outskirts of the city, a stark contrast to Gu Ming's cramped apartment. The lobby was minimalist, filled with white walls and abstract pieces of art that made him feel even more out of place. As he stepped in, he immediately felt a sense of disorientation. The whole place was designed to feel like a different world, silent, cold, and, somehow, unreal. He was greeted by a tall, sharp-faced woman in a lab coat. She introduced herself as Dr. Liu, the head of the institute. Her gaze was professional, but there was something about her eyes that made Gu Ming uneasy. She led him into a large, high-tech lab, with an array of equipment he had never seen before. Massive lights dangled from the ceiling, casting weird shadows across the floor. Monitors lined the walls, displaying grids of light patterns and shifting spectrums. "This is where we conduct our research," Dr. Liu said, gesturing to the various instruments. "Today, we will be testing how light can interact with the human perception of reality." Gu Ming wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he nodded along, trying to suppress his anxiety. He had been to many labs before, but this one felt different, less like a place of science and more like a place where experiments were conducted on things that shouldn't be touched. Dr. Lu led him to a small, chair-like device in the center of the room. It looked like a dentist's chair, but with strange wires and sensors attached to it. "Sit here," she instructed, "and we'll begin the initial phase of the experiment." Gu Ming complied, still unsure of what to expect. As he settled into the chair, he noticed a small group of scientists standing off to the side, watching him intently. There was a buzz of activity, like this was all just another day for them, but to Gu Ming, everything felt surreal. "All right, Mr. Gu," Dr. Lu said, "we're going to expose you to a new type of light that's never been tested before. It's high intensity, designed to stimulate the optic nerves in a way that could reveal untapped potential in human perception. The process might be disorienting at first, but we'll monitor your vitals closely." Gu Ming swallowed. Disorienting wasn't exactly what he wanted to hear. But he figured he had already committed himself to this, so there was no turning back. Dr. Lu gave a nod to the technicians, and suddenly, a blinding flash erupted from above. Gu Ming felt the light wash over him, an intense surge that made his vision flicker, like the world was being painted in white strokes. It was so bright that he couldn't open his eyes, but somehow, he didn't have to. It was as though the light was directly interacting with his mind, shifting the landscape of his thoughts. For a moment, everything went dark. Gu Ming wasn't sure how long he had been unconscious, but when he opened his eyes again, the world looked different. Sharper. Brighter. Unreal. His body felt heavier, and his fingers twitched as if they were vibrating with energy. He looked around, his gaze falling on a nearby shelf of books. He didn't just see the books, he saw the light reflecting off them. And it wasn't just any light, it was as if he could see the very patterns of the light itself, bending and warping, tracing every curve and angle of the objects in the room. The room seemed to breathe, and then, he saw something strange, a flash of something else. He wasn't sure if it was real, but it looked like the image of a woman in the corner, her face distorted by an impossible pattern of light. She was smiling at him, except, no one was there. It was as if the world had split, and Gu Ming could see multiple versions of reality, each one stacked on top of the other, layered by a chaotic wave of light. He gasped and jerked upright in the chair, his hands gripping the armrests. What's happening?" he asked, but his voice sounded foreign to him, distorted, as if it didn't belong in the world he was seeing. Dr. Lu's face appeared above him, blurry at first, and then coming into focus. Her eyes were wide, her mouth moving, but Gu Ming couldn't hear her words. It didn't matter, though. He could hear everything in the room. The faint whir of machines, the soft shuffle of footsteps, the light itself talking to him, if he concentrated hard enough. Gu Ming realized, with a rush of disbelief, that he wasn't just seeing the light anymore. He could control it. His mind could direct it, bend it, twist it like a painter working with colors. He could change the way things looked. No, more than that, he could change what they were. His heart raced. This was no longer photography. This was something else entirely. Gu Ming's head spun as he stumbled out of the chair. His legs felt like they were moving in slow motion, but at the same time, everything around him seemed to speed up. His mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, none of them making sense, none of them truly landing in his thoughts. The light in the room wasn't just light anymore. It was more, much more. It was as if the entire room, the entire building, the entire city was laid out in front of him, each detail illuminated in a way he had never known was possible. He saw the reflection of the overhead lights on the stainless steel walls, the way they bent and curled around the edges of the room. He could see the flicker of each individual filament inside the bulbs, as though they were alive. He saw how the shadows in the corners of the lab were not simply dark, they were alive too, shifting, pulsing, waiting. Dr. Lu's voice cut through the haze of his mind, sharp and demanding. Gu Ming, are you all right? His name echoed in his head, but it felt as if it were coming from far away. He couldn't focus on it. He didn't care. Instead, he was completely consumed by the web of light surrounding him. Then it hit him. He could control it. The light. The shadows. Everything. Without thinking, he raised his hand, and immediately, the light in the room responded. It shifted, bent, retracted like a living thing, wrapping around his fingers as if obeying his command. His heart skipped a beat. The possibilities felt limitless. He could make the light dance, twist, even disappear entirely, and he could fill the empty spaces with the kind of shadow that felt like it was alive, that could consume everything around him. He didn't understand what was happening. There was no way he could. But he felt something else now, a rush of power, something that reached into the deepest part of him, something that he could not push away. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. Gu Ming. Stop. Dr. Lu's voice was more insistent now, but it only seemed to fade as his focus deepened. The light obeyed him like a magnetic field, swirling and twisting, climbing the walls, making the air hum with energy. It was like nothing he had ever felt. A surge of joy mixed with an undercurrent of fear. His thoughts were disjointed, but in the midst of it all, he had a profound realization: he could reshape reality itself. If he could control light to this extent, why couldn't he manipulate other things, other images? What if he could make things appear out of thin air? Or better yet, what if he could make people believe things that were never true? A blur of motion broke through his thoughts. Dr. Lu was suddenly beside him, gripping his arm. Gu Ming, listen to me. Her grip was firm, but it barely registered as his mind danced with endless visions of what he could create. This power is dangerous. You don't understand the consequences yet. Before she could finish, Gu Ming's fingers twitched, and a new light appeared, as if summoned by his very thoughts. It was a strange, unnatural light, pulsing with an ethereal glow. And in the reflection of the light, something else appeared, a figure. A woman. Her face was familiar, yet unfamiliar. He could see her clearly, her features sharp and defined, but she was not physically in the room. She wasn't real. But in the light, in the shadows, she existed. For a fleeting moment, Gu Ming thought he saw her smile. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't possible. He jerked his hand back, but the image of the woman remained, suspended in the corner of the room, shimmering with a kind of unnatural clarity. She was smiling at him, beckoning. Gu Ming's chest tightened as the realization hit him: he could create things, people, memories, out of thin air. He had not only seen her, but he had brought her into existence. And worse yet, she seemed to be aware of him. Dr. Lu was shaking him now, trying to get his attention, but Gu Ming's eyes were locked on the apparition in the light. No, this can't, he muttered, disoriented, his hands trembling. The woman smiled again, her eyes sparkling with an eerie familiarity. Gu Ming, she whispered, her voice distant but clear. It's okay. You can do it. You're meant to. Dr. Lu pulled harder, yanking him back to reality, or at least to a reality that felt less twisted. Gu Ming, you're slipping. Snap out of it. But Gu Ming couldn't pull himself away. He couldn't let go of the woman, the image. She was real in a way that transcended anything he had ever known. In the light, she existed, and in his mind, he was certain that she knew him. He tried to speak, but his words came out garbled, like he was underwater. He felt a hand on his shoulder then, and before he could react, everything snapped back into place. The light faded. The woman was gone. The lab returned to its sterile, artificial calm. Gu Ming stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, trying to collect his scattered thoughts. His mind was a jumbled mess of what had just happened. The woman. The light. The power. He didn't understand. None of it made sense. Gu Ming, Dr. Lu said softly, her voice now stripped of its earlier urgency. You've just experienced something extraordinary. But you need to understand, this power isn't a gift. It's a curse. The words landed on him like a heavy stone. A curse? Look at what you've just done, she continued. You've bent reality, conjured things that aren't even real. That woman? She doesn't exist. She never did. But you made her exist. You made her real. And now, you don't know how to control it. Do you understand what that means? Gu Ming swallowed, his throat dry. He didn't know how to respond. His mind was reeling, but the weight of her words hit him hard. What had he done? What had he unleashed? You can't let this power control you, Dr. Lu said, her voice now firm. People can be manipulated by light. They can be made to believe anything you want them to. But once you've created something that isn't real, it stays with you. And the more you create, the harder it becomes to see the truth again. You'll start to lose track of what's real and what isn't. Gu Ming looked at her, a sense of dread rising in his chest. What do I do now? He asked, barely able to find the words. Dr. Lu sighed, her face softening. We have to find a way to reverse this. To undo the damage. But we can't do it here. It's too risky. You need to come with us. We'll help you. But deep down, Gu Ming felt the pull of the light. He could feel it waiting, just beneath the surface of his thoughts, ready to explode again. Ready to show him more. The more he used it, the more power he felt. The more he wanted to control it. I'll do what I have to, he muttered, barely hearing his own voice. The woman's face flickered in his mind again, and the light, the endless, beckoning light, was always there, just beyond the edge of his awareness. The next few days passed in a blur. Gu Ming's life seemed to splinter into 1,000 fragments. He no longer knew what was real. He no longer knew what was his and what was the creation of his own twisted mind. He spent hours pacing the tiny room at the institute, testing the limits of his ability, pulling images from the air like threads of light. Sometimes they appeared perfectly formed, but other times they fizzled out, leaving only the memory of a shape, a face, an object that he could make people disappear, completely, as if they had never existed at all. And when he looked into their eyes, he could see the flicker of recognition, his recognition, as if they had always been there. But there was something dangerous about it. Something unpredictable. And each time he created something, his mind slipped further into madness. The Institute's scientists warned him that his ability was a double-edged sword. The more he used it, the more power it took, and the more he began to fade. He was not sure how long he could keep up the pretense of control. The days blurred into each other, indistinguishable, like frames from an out-of-focus film. Gu Ming's world had become a place of constant light and shadow, where the boundaries between the two grew ever more fluid. The more he used his abilities, the more they consumed him. It wasn't just the power that ate at him, it was the uncertainty of it all. Every time he looked at something, he couldn't help but wonder, was this real, or had he made it up? Was this his life, or had he simply constructed it? The worst part was how easy it was to create things. It was as if the world itself had become a canvas, and light, once his tool for capturing reality, was now the brush with which he painted it. He could bend and stretch it, shape it into whatever he wanted. People. Places. Memories. All of it was at his fingertips, waiting for his command. The more he experimented, the more powerful it felt. He could recreate a conversation he'd had last week, down to the smallest detail, and make it feel fresh and alive again. He could erase things, people, as if they had never existed, and when he focused hard enough, he could change the way they felt, the way they believed. But there was a price. The more he created, the less he could distinguish what was real. The more he reshaped reality, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers, like a fragile illusion, ready to shatter at any moment. He would look at someone, and the briefest flicker of doubt would fill his mind. Is this person really here? Or am I just imagining them? And then there was the matter of the woman. Every time he closed his eyes, she appeared. The woman with the glowing smile. He had no idea who she was, whether she was a memory, a phantom, or something he had conjured from the depths of his own mind. But she was always there, waiting, a silent presence that filled the corners of his thoughts. And every time she spoke to him, it felt like she knew more about him than he did. The power, the light, it was all beginning to feel like a trap. He stood in the center of the dimly lit room at the institute, his fingers tingling with the aftershock of his latest experiment. The walls were covered with monitors, displaying images of shifting light patterns, but his mind wasn't on the data. It was on the weight of what he had done. The past few days had been a whirlwind of experimentation. At first, he had been careful, tentative even. He had tried to use his new ability in small ways. He'd created harmless things, abstract images, shadows that didn't mean much. But the more he played with light, the more it bent to his will. He had seen the results in the tests. He could manipulate light to the point of creating entire worlds. He had created moments from his past, those fleeting instances he had long since forgotten, and made them feel fresh again. Real again. And in those moments, he had felt a terrifying sense of control, but control was an illusion. He realized that a shadow moved in the corner of his vision, and his breath caught. He knew exactly what it was. A flicker of movement in the darkness. It had become a constant, an unwelcome guest that haunted him every time he closed his eyes. Her. The woman. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about her, about how she always seemed to be watching, waiting. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her voice was like a whisper inside his head, coaxing him forward, urging him to push the boundaries of what he could create. You can control it, she'd told him, her smile glowing through the static of his thoughts. You can make the world bend to your will. You just have to believe in it. But belief was dangerous. Every time he indulged in that belief, something broke. Something slipped away, something he couldn't get back. His hand hovered over a table covered in photographs, his photographs. Some were old, faded, relics of a time before he had realized what he could do. Others were new, freshly developed, their light and shadow still shifting. He could see the world in them, see what he had made of it. But even as he gazed at them, doubt crept in. Were these moments real, or were they just reflections of something he had imagined? He clenched his fists, shaking off the thoughts. He couldn't afford to get lost in them. The Institute had made it clear, his abilities were unstable. Dangerous. If he didn't get a handle on them, he would lose himself completely. Gu Ming. Dr. Lu's voice sliced through the tension, pulling him back to reality. She stood at the door, her face stern, her eyes unreadable. She had been the one to guide him into this madness, the one who had offered him the opportunity to unlock his potential. But now, there was no warmth in her gaze. Only cold calculation. You're pushing it too far, she said, stepping into the room. You've gone beyond what we agreed on. You can't keep playing with this power. It's unstable. It's uncontrollable. Gu Ming's eyes flickered toward her, but his mind was elsewhere. He felt the weight of the power surging through him again, that familiar pull of light, waiting to be shaped. I know what I'm doing, he said, his voice flat, distant. No, you don't, Dr. Lu shot back. You think you do, but this isn't a game, Gu Ming. What you're playing with, it's dangerous. The more you manipulate light, the more you change the fabric of reality itself. And if you're not careful, if you lose control, you could destroy everything. I won't lose control. The words felt hollow, even to him. He had said it to himself 100 times, but the truth was, he didn't know how long he could keep his grip on this power. And the more he tried to fight it, the more it felt like it was slipping away. Dr. Lu's eyes softened, but there was still a harshness in her voice. You have to stop. It's not just about you anymore. This is bigger than you. The Institute can't protect you if you go too far. If you keep going down this path, she trailed off, shaking her head. You won't recognize yourself when it's over. Gu Ming swallowed, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He didn't want to admit it, but part of him knew she was right. He had already begun to lose himself. The light in the room shifted, a small flicker of movement at the corner of his eye. He turned, his heart skipping a beat as a figure appeared in the dark, a woman. Her. His breath caught in his throat. How was she here? How had she, and then, she was gone. Just like that. A ghost in the shadows. Doctor. Lu didn't seem to notice, but Gu Ming's mind reeled. That wasn't possible. That wasn't real. But then again, what was real anymore? Gu Ming, Dr. Lu's voice broke through his thoughts again. We need to leave. Now. I can't, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I'm not finished here. You don't understand, Dr. Lu said, her voice urgent. This is no longer about art. This is about survival. If you don't stop now, you'll unravel the very fabric of reality. Do you understand that? Gu Ming's pulse quickened, and he could feel the light around him, the energy, the power, humming, calling to him. But he knew she was right. He had pushed too far, and now there was no easy way back. The consequences of his actions were too great, too dangerous. The world he had built, the world he had controlled, was already starting to break apart. He had to stop. He had to let go. But could he? Could he really walk away from the only thing that had ever given him a sense of control, a sense of purpose? The answer hit him like a punch to the gut. No. He couldn't stop. Not yet. The realization sank in, he felt the air around him begin to shimmer. The light, the shadows, they were bending, twisting, like something alive, something hungry. The edges of the room blurred, and for a moment, the world felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Everything he had made, the woman, the memories, the world, was threatening to collapse. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to let go. It was too late. The light was already in control.